Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sarah Jane Demy of Demy-Colton, and on behalf of the Demy-Colton team and our sponsor, Parexel Biotech, it is truly my pleasure to welcome you to the 27th installment of the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. Today's topic is 3 strategies for attracting early-stage investment. We welcome all of you who have participated in the past, and of course, we welcome those of you who are new to the Virtual Salon Series. Demy-Colton's mission is all about convening healthcare industry leaders from multiple disciplines to catalyze change in our space. We do this typically through in-person events such as Biotech Showcase, our CEO summits, and our latest event, BioFuture, which took place only a few weeks ago here in New York City. However, during COVID, we launched the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series to maintain our contact with our audience. And what we've learned is that this is a very important medium, and in fact, it will be here to stay in the Demy-Colton Virtual Salon Series. Please keep coming back to them. We will have many different topics going forward. Before we begin, I do want to thank our sponsor today, Parexel Biotech, for coming on board and working with us to organize this great topic for today. And on some housekeeping notes, before I turn the virtual podium over to our moderator, a word about the structure of today's programs. We will begin with a 50 to 55-minute discussion on the topic, which will be followed by a Q&A session. You can submit your questions in the Ask a Question pane, which should be below your screen, and we will address as many as possible. I do ask that you make your questions as brief as possible so that we can actually get through them. Also note that this salon is being recorded and it will be available for on-demand viewing a little bit later today. And any documents provided by our sponsor are available for download in the Event Resources tab. So, to today's salon, 3 strategies for attracting early-stage investment. We have a great group of experts who will share their learnings and experiences with you, and hopefully you'll have a lot of takeaways from this. First of all, I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Dr. Skip Sands. Skip is the Senior Vice President and Senior Medical Officer of Parexel Biotech. And our panelists include Rito Bergerman, MD, PhD, Vice President and Worldwide Head, Health Economics, Outcomes Research at Parexel. Balez Felscudi, Vice President, Health Advances, and Mary Nakata, PhD, Vice President, Venture Investments, Johnson & Johnson Innovation, also known as JJDC. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the virtual podium over to Skip. I will return during the Q&A period. So until then, have a good discussion. Skip, the podium is yours.
Great. Thank you, Jane. Sarah Jane, I'm sorry. This is really a rather exciting time for biotech. I'm sure we've all had multiple investment opportunities in the company, but more importantly is the amount of money that's available. And now there is beginning to, as we slowly see the market emerge over probably the next year, we're going to see a little bit more competition. So it's going to become extremely important for how you position yourself and how you drive your message as you move forward. So it's really about how do you make yourself interesting? How do you make yourself very clear, very short, concise? What's your pitch? What's your 30-second elevator pitch? Those are the really, really important things. And what we'd like to do today is to talk to you a little bit about the things that we've learned over our experiences in the past 20 to 30 years and let you have some background as to what you might be approaching. There are those people in this audience who are very, very experienced, and obviously there are those who are very new to the situation. and we'd like to show you how we can help you move to being very, very active in this environment. So we're going to look today to see, what are the things that we can talk about, using special pathways that might allow you to accelerate your development, how you might be able to position your message so that you can get specific attachment from very good investors, repeat investors, not single first timers, and then understanding how you might be able to not only look at your compound, but how others might be viewing your compound. So with that, I'd like to ask Marion and Balaz to talk a little bit about the idea of determining your goal. What are you looking for in your goal to get us to where you would like to be able to get the investment that you would like to have? So Marion, you've got a lot of experience in dealing with clients around the world. And could you just let us have some pearls?
Sure. So it's probably more like portfolio company. So I do the corporate venture investing for Johnson & Johnson, and we invest in things that are on strategy for the sectors in pharmaceuticals, consumer devices. And so we have a lens in terms of obviously what is important for our business, and because we're strategic investors, but as importantly, we have a lens for what is investable, and that has a lot to do with the science, the differentiation, and also the leadership and the ability of that leadership to actually deliver on the promise of the company. And so I think, speaking to what is the goal of the company, I think individual companies have different aspirations. Some, for example, which are single asset companies, are looking to basically be acquired probably before getting into full development. They don't necessarily aspire to be a fully integrated company with sales and marketing. Some aspire to be platform companies that do want to become the next Alnylam, where they have a pipeline and they commercialize. Other companies are aspire to to potentially be, let's say, become acquired, let's say, early by a farmer, or have appropriate partnerships, and entrepreneurs that want to become serial entrepreneurs and move on to something different. So I think a lot of it has to do with what you have and who you are. And it's important for investors to understand what that exit is. Another, obviously, liquidity point is for investors is IPO. So it's IPO or M&A. And so I think those are both very important aspects to be able to be clear about. And oftentimes when you start out with an interesting science idea, you don't know where it's headed. You don't know if you're a platform company or a single asset company, because if the platform only bears one asset, then you become an asset company. So sometimes you sort of have to roll with those punches. But to your point, Skip, it's something that is important for you to be able to articulate, because as a VC, that exit is something that is part of my original investment thesis, and the amount of funding that will require to get me to that exit is something that is important to know, and important for us to be able to have the appropriate reserves to be able to be good investors and partners of that company until that liquidity point.
So Marion, I have a question that just popped into my head about while you were doing your talking, and it's really about, if I'm sitting on the other side, I'd like to know, the question is, what are my odds of the goal that I set day one is going to be the goal that I have at the end? What in your experience, what have you seen? I mean, that's really because
very low.
Very low. Okay. So
and that's why I think one of the qualities of an entrepreneur is resilience and persistence and creativity. I mean, you ask any VC how many of their companies have not pivoted. It's a very, very small number. And the pivot can be from one it's the same drug and it's a totally different indication. I've had companies that have pivoted that the drug dies, and although they've developed a drug to be an inhibitor of the target, they had activators in their screens, and the activators become drugs for different diseases. I mean, I've had companies go from diabetes to neuroscience to oncology. And so so I'm talking more scientifically now, right? But I think, I've seen platform companies go to single asset companies. So it's not like zero, but I think if you're an entrepreneur and you're not resilient, then maybe you're in the wrong business.
Thank you, Marion. I just wanted to make sure that we got that point out so that people don't feel like they're, I will use the word failing, because you're really not failing. So Balazs, can you highlight some of the things that you might be, or the ways that you could help people work through that pivot?
Yeah, sure. And as Marianne was talking, I was reminded of when I was sort of applying to business school. Maybe this is an odd analogy, but I was sort of thinking about the essays, and the advice that I got at the time is that it's okay if you don't end up there in terms of what your essays are saying when you apply to business school, but you have to have a vision. And I think it's a little bit similar here, right? I mean, you have to be thinking through, what your technology can do, what your science can do. But I think oftentimes that's kind of where early stage companies stop, right? I mean, they present fantastic science, great possibilities, and then they have these grandiose visions of curing this, curing that, being the number one at this, number one at that. And I think it has to be more granular than that. You have to help the investor think through, okay, how much money do I have to invest in this company? What is that money going to be used for? What is the next value inflection point that this company wants to achieve? If it doesn't achieve that, again, what are the pivot options? I think it's very important to actually think through the risks early on, because yes, you want an entrepreneur to have a singular vision and creativity, but again, as Marianne just said, you also want them to be able to pivot and have that flexibility. And I think sort of thinking through that early on is important. We do a lot of work, and I probably should have started with that. Health Advances is Parexel's strategy consulting arm. We work with a lot of early stage companies and early stage both preclinical and clinical on their value story and on their and again this sort of path, right, to a value inflection and exit. And oftentimes, again, what's lacking is really the input and from stakeholders that are not regulatory, right? So everybody wants to get their product through the regulatory, FDA. A lot of times, obviously, US is the biggest market, but how are payers are going to think about this? How are physicians are going to think about it? How are patients are going to think about this? Having sort of a comprehensive view of where you're headed with all the stakeholders having influenced that is really important. And I think investors like that if you can demonstrate that.
So Balazs, that begs the question of, how soon do you start that? Because you're in that fine balance of time and money.
Right. So I think, again, if you're a startup, right, and all you have is an idea, right, or you're spinning out a technology from an academic institution, again, I think your next value inflection point is probably still getting to the clinic, right, getting to some sort of a platform validating event, and that's fine, right? I mean, I'm not saying that you have to have done 1,000 patient surveys, right, to understand what the end market is going to look like. But so that value inflection point is different in each stage. But it actually comes up pretty early, because once you're in the clinic with something, right? And when you're in the clinic with something, people look ahead and they do want to understand, because if you're not going to commercialize, somebody else has to commercialize, right? I mean, you have to be able, even if you're not the one who's thinking about commercializing, you have to be able to exit to somebody else who does. And I think thinking through that entire value chain is pretty critical.
I think also, Skip, it's important to be able to articulate what the pivots might be up front, because it gives investors a little more confidence that there is a plan B, even though they're not funding it. And even though the science might not be there today to support that additional direction, the fact is that if you put money in a company and it fails early before you've actually spent, like the Series A, the investors aren't going to want to just take their money home and do a write-off. They're going to want to try and do the Hail Mary to the pivot. So if you can upfront say, this is our lead indication, but this has applicability and yada, 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 and this is a platform company, and although we're focusing on this, we have visibility to the fact that we could go to this, and this compound. I think that that's always hugely useful.
Thank you, Marion. Rito, I don't want to ignore you because I know you have a lot of valuable input into this conversation. So can you elaborate a little bit on the usage of, I will use the word real world data and how that might be applicable across also creating examples or support for the ideas and the pathways that we're talking about?
So I think this is very important to think about real-world data, but real-world data means also you have to look for the right real-world data. You can collect real-world data from a lot of different sources, but if they are not, let's say, tailored to your new product, whether it's a medical device or a drug or a gene therapy, then it's more or less without any, let's say, leading to the goal that you are finally getting market access. You have to tailor and think about in which way can you use existing real-world data from competitors in your specific treatment in order to have an optimized use of these real-world data. Just because you are collecting real-world data doesn't help you. It must be the right data. And if you look in the past, how real-world data were collected, there are good examples and also bad examples where you see, okay, we invested X million dollars for a great real-world data collection, but they were just wrong. So also you have to be very conscious about this in early stages that you think about it. And I would like to come back to you, what you, Balázs, mentioned about not only the regulatory side, but to think about what is the perspective of the payers, the physicians and the patients, so that you include this in your thinking and your value story. We come later to this. This is very important, the total picture. And it's not sufficient really to look at the medical side from the regulatory perspective. This is really just too short. And real-world evidence and real-world data play an important role, but you must be aware that you have to do it right.
So, Rito, you reminded me of something about the idea that, when I think of research and development in moving forward with companies from 15 years ago, it was really all about the science and registration. And then we started to think further about adding additional pieces like commercial and payers. And thank God we finally got to the point where we started to include the patient. What matters to the patient? What matters to the clinician? Because those are really the important things that should drive where we're headed. I think that's a really something that we have ignored, and we're getting better at it. And I would encourage everybody to keep thinking about that, because actually I think that's a real significant key to success for the future. I know that we're sticking to a timeline of how we're going to approach certain things. So, Marion, I want to ask you about talking about how do you demonstrate value? You're on the development side, and you can say what tweaks your interest, or what gives you confidence from the presentations that you might see, the pitch stories that says to you, this is really good. I think I can start to buy into this.
I think obviously it's number one, is the unmet need significant? And is it an unmet need that's in my scope, right? And I think that's another important thing. Not all VCs invest in everything. So it's important to make sure you're knocking on the right doors. So if it's something for me that is a big unmet need, and importantly, that the solution that you have is differentiating from not just what's that's currently marketed, but also, and what's in development that I can discover on clinicaltrials.gov, but also what I'm aware of from what's in the startup world that is not yet in the clinic. In other words, that might be, that might be more promising than what you have. So you have to look at what you have, what the stage is, and what you're competing against, and then be able to rise to the top to say that if this were to be successful, and if the differentiation that I'm claiming pans out in animals and in the clinic, and then eventually, to be commercialized, that's when we really, I'd say, really perk up. Now, obviously, the farther you're along in proving that, the more expensive your solution is going to be, both from a venture perspective in terms of the valuation of your company and from a BD perspective. So what's a challenge for us, let's say as corporates, is, how do you, I call them like surfing the wave, both from a venture and a BD perspective. How do you allow it to be de-risked long enough on the outside that you're not bringing in something that is so risky that it's your own J&J's development dollars that are being spent to, let's say, see this to a no-go, versus allowing syndicated capital to be able to get to that go, no go. And if you wait too long and de-risk it too long on the outside, it becomes unaffordable to onboard and do a BD deal, because now all of a sudden it becomes a huge competitive process and the value of that asset is much bigger. So that's why I call it like surfing, like how do you catch that wave at the perfect place? So that being said, and then the other piece of it is for us, in terms of value, what is the value of investing versus the value of doing a strategic deal, like a license, an acquisition, an option deal, a partnership? And so all of that really depends on how much risk we want to, discharge with syndicated capital versus how much it is important for us to strategically own something and control the development rather than have the partner do it. And I think that comment sort of feeds into like Balazs and Rito, because if the company has a development plan that we think is robust, sophisticated, and will get us the data that we need, we might be more willing to allow it to exist and be run on the outside and be willing to do that BD deal later at a much more expensive price. But if that development plan is substandard and we feel that we're going to have to reproduce it, that development plan is adding zero value to us, and it's creating a burn on the investors that's not going to get a return on investment. Because we go to do that BD deal, we'll be repeating the phase 1B or the phase 2A, because that data, either the way this study was designed, or worst case scenario, the study doesn't even generate the positive data because it wasn't designed properly.
So Balazs, you were shaking your head or nodding. Let's put it that way. Yeah, you're not shaking your head. So please, I know you have something to say.
I wanted to jump in on a couple of points. One is the patient aspect. So I don't mean to sound cynical, and hopefully it doesn't come across that way, but the need of the patient is sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? I mean, there are plenty of disease areas, and we can talk about sort of, antibiotics and the, microbial resistant drugs, addiction, substance abuse. There's a ton of unmet need, but the ecosystem is not supportive of large drugs. I think infectious diseases is changing a little bit, and it's coming back to focus because of COVID and because of the vaccines, but actually more on the vaccine side than on the therapeutic side. But we need to think through sort of, again, I come back to the value chain, right? I mean, it used to be that, frankly, big pharma was the exit, right? You either go public and try to sort of commercialize yourself. Some companies are successful, or you sell yourself to big pharma. Now there are other, exit options. There are even PE firms jumping in to sort of support commercialization. There's sort of at the end of the value chain, there's more options. And I think you kind of need to think through what those options are. But to be able to do that, you also need to think about what are those other investors or other potential partners want, right? What does big pharma focus on, right? This is why immuno-oncology has become hot, and there's a lot of startup activity there and a lot of investment because big pharma is focusing on that, right? As I said, infectious disease is coming back into focus, autoimmune diseases. So you have to sort of live with all of that. And yes, the patient component is extremely important. Obviously, we all hear because we hold that near and dear. But again, from a business standpoint, those other aspects are critical too.
So Balazs, let me ask this question then. Is that really relative to the situation where if your exit plan is for, say, out license or sell versus, some small, very small biotech that's working on a very rare disease and may have patient advocacy support and things of that sort? Is that a different model?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we run into on the other side of the value chain, right? Not the early stage, but the commercialization is sort of the second drug problem, right? A lot of companies do have ambitions to become a commercial organization, and that's great. Other than, again, some of the rare diseases and some, oncology indications, having only one product, for a company for a long period of time is not financially sustainable. So you really need to think about, am I going to be able to build the pipeline here, right? Either organically or inorganically, that's going to sustain a commercial organization. That's what, that's what the hypothesis is when you try to go commercial, and a lot of companies do try to do that, but a lot more companies try than are successful. So again, we encourage companies to really understand their options, understand the exit opportunities, because that's what the investor is going to want to finance, right? The investor is always, the company comes with the vision, the investor comes with the money, right? And they're going to be a lot more practical and pragmatic when it comes to, what happens to the company.
So Rito, asking as we're talking about values and when to exit and when not to exit, things of that sort, let me ask you this question about the data. And we've talked about good data versus bad data, right data, correct data, but however you want to put it, I want to ask you about when should you be really considering and making sure that you don't miss the window of time to create data that's going to be effective and make payers pay attention, or for that matter, big pharma say, hey, listen, they've hit a couple of what I would call the milestones. It's not only efficacious, we know what works in the mechanism of action, but what other time period? Are we looking later? Can you wait till into phase 2 and afterwards, or should you really be collecting things early on?
So for me, the ideal starting point for this is in the phase 2, so that you really have a vision and a clear understanding what is necessary for the regulatory approval and what is necessary for the payer approval. So the payer perspective is very important. And if you are only focusing on the great medical outcome, and the medical outcome which is collected during the clinical trial phases is not reflecting the payer preference. So the payer is interested in, is this really clinically relevant? What is the outcome? It could be that the outcome is sufficient for the regulatory approval, but not sufficient for the reimbursement approval. And the consequence could be you have your approval from the FDA or the regulatory body in your specific country, and then there is a request, show me the relevance for us. We are looking for other data. It's not convincing that this is statistically significant and you got the approval. And then this would lead to a delay in your market access by 6 months, by 2 years. I have seen this for 3 years, for 5 years, because the data were just not there. And then you are starting about, yeah, real world data. We are looking for this. And then it takes time, it takes time. If you have a typical time frame of, let's say, between phase 2 and market authorization of 4 years, 5 years, so I think the ideal start for this is the phase 2, then you are much clearer about your clinical effects, but you also can start the payer research. What are the preferences, and also maybe the patient preferences? And Balázs, I really completely in agreement with you. The patients, they would, let's say, their preference is, if it's a minor benefit, even if it costs enormous amounts, I would like to have this. So we have to take this into our value story. And there are examples in the past where the developing company took this into consideration, how to really include the patient voice and the patient preference in order to influence, to change the payer preference. So this is also something which is very important. So you must be open and not only concentrating on your clinical outcome. Look at the total picture. And this includes, finally, for market access, definitely the payer preference and the patient preference.
So Mary, I have to ask you this one. From the investor side, are people looking at that stage now? Is that a transformation of the evaluation process? Because I don't believe that maybe 5-10 years ago that was part of the equation of the evaluation.
Which stage? Which stage?
I'm talking about the idea of looking at the patient, data, not efficacy and safety, always there. I'm talking about things that are looking at payer situations and data to support payer situations and patient desires, as Rita was speaking about.
It depends on the stage of the company. I mean, if you're an early stage company when you don't have a lead and you're doing a screen, I think that's a little bit too early. I mean, obviously, if you have something that's clinical stage, yes, it's something that definitely goes into the equation. I think one other point, I guess, related to data that I just wanted to elaborate on is I've seen for some even earlier stage companies that have, a handful of phase 1 patients that are, let's say, in a rare disease. They're early clinical, the first in human is in patients not in normal human volunteers, to actually use synthetic control arms using real world data to say that, okay, maybe we only have 10 patients, but if we can compare them against 10,000, right, then we understand, are those 10 really a signal to the noise? And so that's added a lot of power to very early and very small data sets, which I think is very useful. So, but that being said, I think in general, data and these types of analytics are really shaping how investors and more importantly, I think pharma are viewing the strength of these assets, that are more clinical stage, and they're going beyond, to your point, just safety and efficacy, and going more into is this data real? And in the real world, could the patient population or even the indications be bigger than what the company's even projecting, given the fact that you can sort of mine real world data for, let's say, pathways, and not just particular, drugs or targets.
Great. Rita, going back to that real quickly, do you want to say anything at all about synthetic control arms? So a great opportunity. I feel like I'm in a courtroom and the lawyer just opened up something that they were told that they couldn't say. Marion, thank you for saying that.
So I'm a great fan of synthetical control arms, which really helps to design the phase 3 trials to reduce the sample size. And it's definitely, for me, the way to go, especially for rare diseases where it's hard really to find the patients and to reduce the sample size required subjects as much as possible. So the use of this relatively new technique is, for me, a great step forward. I remember 15 years ago, first of these intentions in multiple sclerosis, and it was rejected. But now more and more, it's also accepted from the regulatory bodies, and I think you are well aware of this.
Great. Balazs, I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about all of these things related to data and how do we create a story and the right story, what's your experience or your recommendation as it relates to external validation of that value story that you've created? Because, you know, we have that saying, you know, drank too much of our own Kool-Aid. And I'm wondering whether or not, you know, early biotechs get into that.
Right, and I'm obviously a huge proponent of that, and we see that, right? And you know, hopefully Marion can attest to that. Is that having that external point of view that's not just the company saying this is the best thing since sliced bread, but you know, KOLs, physicians, you know, payers, right, attesting to that is very powerful. There's also obviously the other validation, which is sort of an external partnership, right? But even that partnership, think about the partner. So the partner is not really looking at this any differently than an investor, right? The partner wants to make sure that this works, right? So for those discussions too, you know, going out and doing some sort of a research. And again, you could argue that if you're a really early stage, it cannot, you know, it can be smaller as you progress, you know, it needs to be larger and larger. But having that external validation, external project, to me is really important. And budgeting for that is also very important, right? I mean, oftentimes, you sort of put a scientific plan together, you put a development plan together, but you're not really budgeting for that external validation component, and then you're scrambling to find money for that, right? And I think thinking about it ahead of time is really critical. Again, you can stage gate it, you can, you know, phase it, you can modularize it, you can increase it as you go, as you progress with your development, but at each stage, that becomes very important. One other thing that I would like to add to that, we talked about attracting investors, and I made the point that attracting partners is similar to that. Attracting talent is also that, right? I mean, being able to convince, you know, high quality individuals to join your organization, having that external validation of your platform, of your technology, of your product helps with that as well. And you obviously need that to be successful.
And I would add the SAB is another way of, again, they've done the diligence and they're willing to sign on. So I think all of those things are useful. And I would say the partnerships are a great way. Oftentimes they're non-dilutive because those partnerships or collaborations, usually the partner will say, I want to see this and I'm willing to pay that. And so your platform can be validated while a partner is using it for a particular target. But I would say you want to have a little bit of restraint, because if all you had a whole lot of partnerships, that creates a different problem, because the bandwidth of your company is now spent on all of these projects for which you do not necessarily own the product, because that would be sort of collaborative, or it's already been, the partner has an option or a license to that product they're generating. You don't want to become basically a CRO for a lot of other parties. So you be very selective in terms of how many of those partnerships you put in place. And they could be cheap early for the first early adopter, but they should get more expensive as your platform gets more validated.
That's great. That's great. So let me ask you a little question about in the early stages here, we talked about the idea of needing to pivot, obviously, and in changing maybe your direction and how that might affect things that are going on. If you have a really good strategic plan laid out, and you have that initial success, Marion, what kind of a bump do you typically see in the value? Because again, this is all, when you're sitting in the company point of view, there is value to the patient, and then there's investor value. If you're pre-IPO, if you're post-IPO, obviously the stock market will tell you what people are thinking. But there's a value piece, and a good strategic plan with an initial success. Early phase 1, or should I say, even that first patient dosed. What kind of a value?
So the classic value inflection points are development candidate. Some people call it new molecular entity, NME, and that's when the compound is IND ready. It's past GLP tox. It has an efficacy package in animals. So that's a big one. That being said, my experience is I've had a number of my companies exits even before development candidate, and it's because the science around that novel target is compelling, and the preclinical in vivo data that you have, but you don't have, let's say, the GLP tox, or you might need to have tweak something in terms of the DMPK of the molecule, but that the value proposition of the target is so hot that somebody's willing to onboard that just to be able to develop it, right? So there's those rare things, but development candidate is one. And then I guess the second one would probably be, early clinical data. So in other words, but the slippery slope is that if you're in phase 1, which is obviously not designed to show efficacy, unless it's really eye-popping, the phase 1 data is not necessarily going to create a huge value inflection. I mean, what you've demonstrated, right, is that at least it's not going to be a safety issue, right? If you have 3 patients, but if you're oncology and you have patients that have failed everything else, the fact that you're going to see PRs, CRs, it's low. But if you do, that could be compelling, right? So I would say early clinical data, but and then obviously the big one is I would say really compelling phase 1B is huge. Phase 2A, I mean, each of those, it really depends on the indication, and also, to be honest with you, the competitive nature. So you're always really, you should always have a tracker of who might license, acquire, et cetera, and then see where they're headed, because, that list could get smaller as those parties pick other options, right, that are competitive with yours. And so you really want to make sure that you're tailoring your drug, your product, you're looking at combinations that they might do with what you're developing, and you really need to come up with almost like a strategic BD map that fits the science and of the drug and where your drug would fit into their portfolio.
So I was, when you were saying that, I was thinking about a strategic customer list. I start off with 50 customers and I get down to 25 and then 15 and then to 10, as the drug moves along the development process. So that's great. I want to ask another question, and this is to anybody, to all 3 of you. I want you to comment a little bit on expedited development or regulatory processes and how you see that impacting especially early biotech and the value. Are there any specific programs that in your eyes or your experience that have specifically added significant value, pre-IPO obviously, or even post, because a certain program was able to be applied? Don't all jump at once.
No, I know there are some, for example, that allow, let's say, a more seamless transition for an indication where there is no marketed drugs really that work, to a more seamless way to say go from a phase 1 dose escalation to an expanded to the multiple ascending dose, where then you expand the dose that you pick after the MAD into something that could be registrationable with an accelerated approval, which would, and so this notion that you're almost seamlessly going from phase 1 into a registrationable study is something that I've seen. But again, it has to be in an area where there's like extreme unmet need. And what it does is it makes it very attractive for investors, because you realize, let's say that the time to to actually launch is much shorter.
Yeah, you used to. I'm sorry, Blaise, go ahead.
I was just going to add the flip side of that, right? That it also has to be an indication where you're not increasing the risk, right? So if really, the phase 2 is not large enough, or it's not, you haven't found the dose yet, right? But you're sort of jumping to a registrational trial and then you fail it, right? Then obviously you're worse off than if you had taken sort of the longer route, right? So I just want to add that an expedited process is fantastic from a time to market standpoint, could potentially also increase the risk, which you need to be aware of.
And the other kind of devil's advocate is that if you're a company that doesn't intend to commercialize something because you're just a little startup, you're going to have to find your partner really fast, because you're not going to be able, from a CMC manufacturing perspective, to be able to transfer that to the commercialization partner while you're in midstream of a pivotal study, correct? So in other words, if a big pharmas would prefer to control that registration study, because it requires a whole host of things that go beyond just like running the clinical study, right? From CMC to reporting to all of those things, right? And the commercialization plan, the launch plan, all of those things are really important. So it almost forces the issue that you need to find a partner for that commercialization sooner rather than later.
I would like to add, so my answer is it depends. So if you are in the space of orphan drugs and orphan drug designation, so then if you can really get an expedited developing process, and you are compared to the other developers first on the market, you have definitely a competitive advantage, because you have exclusivity in a lot of countries for a long time period, 11 years, or you have an extended patent validity and so on, which could play a significant role with respect to the return on investment. And this could play also an important role for investors to think about, is it worth to have an accelerated or expedited development process?
So I like all of the comments. Marion, I used the word seamless, and I think that's really where we're headed, or we are at this point in time. And we're seeing that level of seamless design, phase 1, phase 2 being kind of combined together. And I understand and have been, I will say, had an obstruction in my life as it related to that. What happens when you're not able to produce enough commercial grade material during your phase 3 so that you can get an approval, or you're going to be delayed because it just takes time for the inspection and all of those things that you'd like to be able to get done while it's happening. So to me, there's always this, it's kind of a very tough kind of integration of all of the pieces that need to occur. And I would guess from an investor's point of view, when you finally see that one or two companies that come in with an asset with the right data, the right stage of where they're at, the right commercialization process, the right everything else, the value is rather high. Is that correct? That can probably trump even a great efficacy. Would you say that?
It depends.
Good. Well, good. Then I'm not, Well,
sometimes, yes. Yeah. So sometimes that can be the case.
Okay, great. We're getting close to when we should be really looking at some questions and answers. So I'm going to open it up to, if you have any questions, please, you may submit them, and we'll start to deal with them. But I'd like to ask, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, which is, are there geographic considerations? I know we had this conversation in the preparations for all of this, but I'm really curious as to whether or not, when we look at this value creation and we look at investors, can anyone on the panel talk to me about the idea that what the geographic differences are and how do we address them?
Yeah, I can jump in, real quick. Obviously, for most therapies, the U.S. will be the predominant market. I think Europe, we find pricing and market access in particular is a lengthy and meticulous process. Almost all the time, there's a comparator that you need to compare your drug to. You need a health economic argument why your drug is better, not just from a clinical utility standpoint, but from a health economic standpoint. That's the data that Rito was talking about and the analysis that you need for that. So we look at the European markets and frankly advise our clients to start planning that work early. You'll need that for the U.S. as well, but certainly in Europe, that's often sort of the gatekeeper. And I think the Asia Pacific markets, and I certainly don't want to lump them into one, because they're all very different. Usually, China, South Korea, and Japan are sort of the big markets that we're being asked to look at. Again, in Japan, most of the times, you have to sort of redo the entire development program, right? Yeah. So you'll have to plan for that. Whether that makes sort of economic sense, whether there's a partner that's willing to do that, is another thing. But you need to know those geographic differences to be able to plan whether or not you aspire to those.
So Marion, can you comment quickly on the investor approach from those geographies? Because that's another piece that I think we should not ignore.
Agree. So, I mean, from an investing perspective, innovation can come from anywhere, and we can commercialize, drugs that we get from anywhere globally. That being said, we are deployed geographically because it's important to have boots on the ground, in our opinion, to be able to understand how the ecosystem works, who you syndicate with. So our investors in Europe are specializing in that. And we think that that's incredibly important. And doing investment in any given country, there's all different, like even from a logistics perspective, is very unique. So we have investors also in China to support Asia Pacific. And so there's all kinds of nuances and important aspects of how you get deal flow and how you syndicate, which is important for, we believe, to have investors in those geographies.
Okay. So Skip, there are a lot of questions in here.
Go for it, Sarah.
Okay. Well, we're going to start pinging them over to you. Okay. So one of our CEOs who's listening to us right now said, that as a CEO, he's an experienced CEO whom I know, it's always important to have one or more backup plans. But if you describe these scenarios to investors, do you risk generating uncertainty on their part regarding your original plan, i.e., making them kind of concerned about what you're asking them to invest in?
Marion, why don't you start? I have my opinion, but I'd love to hear what someone who does this all the time.
I call it the possible future direction slide at the end. So I think it's not about lack of focus, but that's what I call it. That you've thought about it, and that's not your ask. But if you have to go there, you have a plan, B, C, D.
I mean, can it not also be viewed as the follow-on to a success of the original?
That's what I'm saying, future plans. Yeah. It could be, what is it beyond the raise that I'm asking for? That we have aspirations, this could be bigger and better, but we're focusing on this now, and this is where we could head.
Right. Skip?
I agree. I like the safety net approach. To me, it is... this is what we're doing. This is what we're focused on. This is what we want the money for. This is what we're going to deliver on. But,
Okay.
strange things happen. So you have to be able to respond. So what are you going to do if the roof starts to fall in tomorrow? What are we going to do? Well, we're going to fix it. This is what we're going to go. This is our the backup option. Simple as that.
I think all of us know those CEOs, biotech CEOs that are successful are also nimble.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yes.
So, okay, Rito Velez, any comment to add to that?
We can move on to other questions.
Okay. So the next question is, with the price controls being an issue with Congress now, how do you evaluate the risk of the quote unquote third leg of the stool, discovery, regulatory approval, market access, and commercialization? That's more than 3 legs.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll jump in real quick, and obviously, no one knows how the politics will play out. We've heard this risk, or we've had some form of this risk for decades, right? So I think this comes up. It's a popular issue, and it definitely will continue to come up. Whether or not Congress will be able to regulate it in a meaningful way, any differently than it is today, I have my skepticism about it, but again, it's one of those things that you sort of have to understand the political environment you're in. But we don't consider that a huge near-term risk to pricing or sort of innovation in general. Okay,
great. Anybody else want to say anything?
Yeah, I do real quickly, only because the idea that we've seen this type of price control and price evaluation, value assessment in Europe. And so at the very least, I would be thinking about worst case scenario, that we walk into the same situation a year from now. And how are you going to do? What's your answer? How are you going to prepare for that? Not that I have to, but just in case.
And I want to say that I think that there's a lot higher likelihood that the market is going in that direction with precision medicine, with value-based contract, with outcome-based contract, right? There's a number of ways that the stakeholders can sort of take cost out of the system without necessarily hurting prices. I see those happening, and obviously there's a trend towards that. And I think I would ride that, or I would sort of try to understand that much more sort of in the near term, right, than some sort of price control by Congress.
Yeah, I mean, the discussion has been going on as long as I've been in this industry, and there's no solution. It's not going to be solved soon. So let's move on to another question, again from another earlier stage CEO. And his particular question is, as a startup, does it make sense for me to talk about an exit strategy? Does any entrepreneur know when, how, or if there will be a liquidity event, especially as an early stage company? I guess, Marion, I think we pinged that over.
That's a great question. And sometimes no, right? I mean, if you're like seed or even Series A, it's implicit, right? Like M&A, IPO, right? But that being said, as you grow and mature, maybe you want to be a fully integrated Tesaro. So I would say you don't have to, like, super early on. But I would argue that by the time you're at the end of your Series B, you better sort of have some thoughts in mind, right? But I would say if you're seed in Series A, it's not necessary per se.
Okay, great. Okay, so while I've been focused on these questions, a whole group of other questions have come in. So let's see if we can take as many of them as possible. We'll start at the bottom. What is the single most important stage in investment philosophy or change in investment philosophy post-COVID in the bioscience space? I think all of you can respond to that. There are no changes?
Well, I mean, I don't know what's the single most important one. There's definitely obviously new modalities emerging, new technologies, mRNA in particular, and that's fantastic. I think the commercialization model is changing, right? There's a little bit of a hybrid between in-person reps and digital and omni-channel commercialization. I think that actually opens up some opportunities at the commercialization, and I know I'm focusing a lot on that, right? But like I mentioned, I think we do need to think all the way through that. So I think being aware, again, what's the end of the road or potential ends of the road is really important. Those are just a couple that I see.
I would say also diagnostics are no longer sort of the stepchild, and I would say also the notion about accelerated clinical development after what we saw, what can happen with the vaccines, is probably going to be interrogated, and there might be opportunities for that.
I think regulatory flexibility is the thing that I have seen globally, that I can't imagine. None of the things that we're talking about could have occurred unless there was an opening experience in any one of the agencies, specifically the FDA, where they said, we're not going to take the standard review times as to documents being even submitted. We're not talking about data review. We're just talking about documents being reviewed. I know that we were able to turn around something, essentially over a weekend, a submission and start in the early COVID days. And that's just amazing. That would never have occurred. And so to me, that's going to affect everything. Everything.
Well, is it here to stay? Is that flexibility here to stay?
And that's the question. As long as, and I will use the word nobody gets burned, or the phrase that nobody gets burned. In other words, somebody tries to do fast data and patients get hurt. I think that they now realize, just as we all now know, you can work remotely. We all work remotely. We have meetings remotely, as much as we all like to have them in person, but we have them effectively remotely. I believe that is going to have a continuous input, an impact on everything that we do.
Okay, thank you. Marion, this question is over. And I think actually, Skip, this is for everybody. What does large pharma consider a good platform to invest in? Any preference for the types of molecules they prefer over others?
Yeah, biologics, small molecules, like oligos. I think undrugging the undruggable, it's classic, right? So, I would say head there. I think new frontiers, things like molecular condensates, where it's more new biology, where you don't even know how to drug people are figuring that out, is a little trickier. But I would say drugging the undruggable is a good place to start. And it could be small or large molecule.
If anybody else want to add to that?
I have nothing more to say.
Cells, I should say.
Yeah, there you go.
So from my perspective,
sorry. Gladys, Rita?
Yeah, from my perspective, looking also in the interest from the peer side, there's a strong interest and focus on gene therapies, really to have the chance for rare diseases, genetic diseases, to treat them, and with one shot, more or less, to have them cured so far. And if there are, let's say, promising findings to be successful, I think they have a chance to be really of high value for investors if they are successful.
Yeah. Speaking about rare disease, there is a question that came in that asks about the value of REMAT designation specifically. And I think, Skip, this particular CEO wanted that question to go to you. Regen Medicine.
Yeah. So when we look at the, regenerative medicine, wow, it's probably, it kind of covers a whole gamut of things in the development process. And honestly, the idea of speaking about what the value it can be, it can speed up your time. Therefore, anything that speeds up your time decreases your cost. So, we kind of forget that idea. There's
Right.
the standard burn rate, but, at the same time, you may be looking at less numbers and things of that sort. So I think that it really depends upon that program, and as that program continues to evolve, because there are continual updates. I can tell you that I'm only versed in what I've been taught by our SMEs. And I can tell you that the last time I heard, there's a new update to PDUFA coming and all of the things that are coming with it. And they said, it's going to all change again. So that person, if you'd like, get their name and whatever, and we can contact them and give them whatever the latest update is. But I'm not going to go any further because it depends on the compound and it depends on where they are.
Okay. Okay, anybody else want to add to that before we move on? So let's get back to another question that came up in your discussion. One of our viewers wanted to know if you see a difference between European biotech companies when looking at investing or partnering. What is the difference, is the question, between US-based companies and European companies in your perception with regard to partnering or investing?
None, really. I mean, in the best of all worlds, right? If it's a good scientific fit, I think we're happy to engage for both. I have noticed that a lot of the European companies are trying to take advantage of the U.S. markets rather than the European markets in terms of, riding that IPO wave. And they oftentimes will have a challenge getting crossovers, which are mostly based in the U.S., to lead those investments. And so, that creates, a bit of a drag, but but that being said, it's really a minor point, and that's not always the case. And what also companies are very shrewdly doing is becoming cross-border very early on.
Right.
I would argue it's Europe and Canada where they actually have their C-suites and offices in, San Francisco or Boston. And so that's one way of sort of smoothing out, let's say, that transition. But there's a lot of amazing, innovation in Europe, and I think we should all take advantage of it.
I mean, biotech is global, right?
Yeah, totally.
No borders.
The only thing I would add very quickly is that I think Mariam made this point earlier. It really doesn't matter where innovation comes from, but to the extent many companies do, focus on the U.S. as the largest pharmaceutical market, knowledge of the U.S. market, which frankly is complicated, complex. We talked about the payer system, right? Payers are price takers, but at the same time, they have utilization restriction tools in their hands much differently than in Europe, for example. That understanding is critical, right? So I don't want to generalize whether or not a European biotech has that knowledge about the U.S., but to the extent that's necessary, I think the European or ex-US in general, biotech companies do need to arm themselves with the knowledge of how the US market operates.
Right. Okay. Anybody else want to add to that? If not, let's move on to another question from another CEO. And his particular question is, are CV programs still viable for VC funding and for pharma? And if not, which indications are hotter? I don't know if that means that this particular company is convertible to other indications, but Marion, do you want to jump on
we
that?
could start with, we're no longer in heart failure, let's say, in the cardiovascular, cardiovascular space. So that being said, we have some commercial interest in thrombosis. And so we are more, we had merged cardiovascular with metabolism and focused more on the complications of, let's say, diabetes. Cardiovascular, it's still investable. I think that, but that being said, it's definitely more of like a niche that has to, again, fit the appropriate unmet needs. So it's not as popular, obviously, as oncology or neuroscience. right? So it's, but I would say anything with an unmet need is investable.
Yeah, and so we do see, again, immuno-oncology aside, autoimmune diseases aside, right, which are very, we do see sort of a renaissance of renal, right, nephrology, cardiovascular, right? I mean, what you have to be careful about is, again, I sound like a broken record, but sort of what's the value chain and what's the potential exit? I mean, there are big pharma companies, again, infectious diseases, there was a massive exit, right? Antibiotics by big pharma companies, but in cardiovascular, right, Novartis, BMS, right? I mean, there are big pharma companies that would definitely want to grow their portfolio. So I think there's an exit there. There are private equity companies that are financing cardiovascular commercialization. So again, there's light at the end of the tunnel, but what that light is and how faint or dim or strong is, you need to know before you go down a path.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Bazas. There is a question that came in, actually a comment. One of our viewers said they totally agreed with you when you placed addiction and substance use disorders in the same bucket as antibiotics. And his question further is, do you have any advice on identifying investors willing to engage in the addiction space? So, really important question.
I know it is super hard. I mean, I had a client, and it broke my heart because we were like literally hunching over an Excel model, right? Of like what is the the epidemiology of substance abuse, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, all of those, and how many patients there are, and then you get to the potential revenue per patient, right? And that's when it starts to break down. I don't know if I have an easy answer. It sort of ended up not working out for that company or that client. And, frankly, for the reasons that I mentioned, we just couldn't find an investor or a partner that would have financed the phase 2 proof of concept study in any one of those addictions, right? So I don't know that I have an easy answer. I haven't, for the reasons that I mentioned, I haven't looked at this market in probably a couple of years. I'd have to look at it again. It won't be easy.
But do you think that today, with the advent of psychedelic therapeutics, that there may be a changing scenario?
But potentially, I mean, I think, and you can certainly argue that the Purdue Pharma thing, I mean, sort of, shown a spotlight on this area. It's the reimbursement system, right? This is why I said that sort of patient needs are sort of necessary but not sufficient, right? I mean, just like antibiotics, the reimbursement system is completely broken, right? I mean, there is no path to reimbursement, and if there is no path to reimbursement, how are you going to get paid for it, right?
Right. Okay. All right, let's move on to another question from a European CEO who says some years ago, IP protection and your island was regarded as an essential component to attract investors at any stage. His question is that still the case, in particular since effective protection in the U.S. is so difficult?
Yes, for drugs. It's a little murkier when and we haven't talked a lot about this, if it's a data science type of opportunity, so where it's an algorithm. But I would say for drugs, at least for us, that's still really important, the IP moat.
Okay. Anybody else?
And that's part of that goes into the modeling for the EMPV of the compound, right? And where is the cliff for that fall off of exclusivity?
Okay, we do have quite a few other questions, but we're coming up on a hard stop, the end of our discussion. So Skip, do you want to wrap up? We talked about the 3 things for early stage companies. Do we want to do a round robin with everybody to just get like 3 pointers for the early stage companies that are listening to this conversation? And we will share the questions with you. Some of them are very long and somewhat complicated. They're too long to respond to here.
Great, Sarah. Thank you. I think that's a great idea. So if I were to ask, and we'll we'll start with you, Marion. You always make you first. But we're going to, three things. What are three things that, short phrases? What do we want early biotechs or biotechs in general to know and to focus on?
So focus on tailoring your outreach to investors. Make sure it's in scope. Make sure it's for them. Make sure that if you need a lead investor first, you're looking for a lead investor first, and that you have an ask. I think from an investing perspective, those are three important things, and that you have, we didn't talk about this a lot, credibility to that ask. So if you're going to ask me for $2 million so that you can get to the end of phase 1A, I'm going to say you don't know what you're doing. Yeah, I don't want to listen to the pitch. So those are some pieces of advice from me.
Great. Balaz?
I guess a couple of things I would point out is, one is the external validation that we talked about, to have input from payers, physicians, patients, not just from a regulatory standpoint. And then the other is make it easy for the investor, right? Don't just focus on the science. What is the investment for? What are the risks that we talked about, and potential sort of fallback options? And then how is this investor going to make a lot of money, right? What's the exit for the investor, not just for you?
Rito?
Think about really the investors. So registration is not everything, but registration without reimbursement is nothing. Think about that your value story includes also the payer perspective, because this is very important to get reimbursement, and the reimbursement is finally one major reason for the investors to invest in your product, in your company.
So I agree with everything that's been said. I would reemphasize exactly what you just said, Rito, is it's not registration in the long run for the company. It's for, getting paid for what you've done, and can you do it successfully? I think that's really important. Don't drink your own Kool-Aid. Get external input. Know that what you're really trying to talk about and confidently talk about is real and can be validated, because otherwise I think you're going to waste a lot of people's time, including yourself, and you're going to get frustrated really quickly.
Time and money.
Time and money. Yeah, it is about that. And be confident. No, give your investors only reasons to say yes. No reasons to say no. So make sure your pitch, your data, and your thoughts are bulletproof. That's it.
Okay. Great discussion, everybody. And the time goes by very, very quickly, sometimes too quickly. We'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. And before you sign off, you'll see a brief survey that we'd like you to take. If you can do that, it will take a moment to do it. And before we officially sign off, I want to thank Rito, Marion, Balzas, and Skip for leading this great discussion. As I said, it could go on for quite a while, just even based on the questions that have been coming in. And for everybody who's listening to us, please join us at our next Demy-Colton virtual salon, Live and Die by Your Data, on December 1. And until then, stay safe, everyone. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for being a part of this. We're signing off.
Thank you.